Hello, everyone, and welcome to Electricity Canada's Conversation Series. Electricity Canada is the national voice for sustainable electricity for its members and the customers they serve as the country works towards a net zero by 2050 future. My name is Farhan Mirza, and I'm pleased to be your host for today's webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm broadcasting you from today is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. I'd also like to recognize Canada as the land of the First Peoples, Inuit, and Métis. I would like to pay homage to the Indigenous peoples past, present, and future that continue to live, work, and educate on this land. This land is shared through historic treaties, developed through contemporary treaties, and one that continues to be unceded territory. The Electricity Canada Conversation Series features presentation from our corporate partners, and the series will highlight a variety of Canadian and international solutions to current and future challenges faced by our industry. Working with our partners, these webinars have been developed to be of specific interest to those working in the electric utility space from generation through to the customer. For a list of upcoming sessions, please check out Electricity Canada's brand new website at the same address, www.electricity.ca. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to go over. Our session today is scheduled to run from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Questions can be asked, and we encourage you to do so as they come to mind by typing them into your questions function on your screen to the right of your to the right panel. We'd encourage you to ask them throughout the presentation. We'll be asking them at the end of the session as time permits. Also, a brief survey will be sent to webinar participants at the conclusion of the session, and we'd love to hear about any topics you'd like to have covered on this series in the future. Lastly, please keep an eye out for future webinars and events through our monthly newsletter, Current Affairs. With over 6,000 subscribers, Current Affairs is the place to go for Canadian industry news as we connect the national value chain from generation through to the customer. If you'd like to receive Current Affairs, you can subscribe to this free publication on our website, again, at electricity.ca. Moving on to today's conversation series, I'd like to welcome ContactPoint 360. We'll be talking to us about leveraging AI to augment the vetting process of hiring top talent. ContactPoint 360 are presenting this webinar to provide insights on how they're leveraging AI in talent acquisition and recruiting, as well as the way forward when it comes to leveraging AI technologies in finding top talent. Again, a facilitated Q&A will be conducted at the end of the session. And to take us today through today's presentation from ContactPoint 360, I'd like to welcome Daniel Chung, the VP of Global Client Services.
Everyone.
Daniel, welcome to the conversation series, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Farhan. So as Farhan mentioned, today's topic that we're going to be covering is really on how CP360 and other organizations in the space can really leverage AI to augment the hiring and vetting process in terms of selecting top talent for your organizations. Myself, I am the VP of Global Client Services within ContactPoint 360. I've had about just a decade and a half in the BPO space, working with a lot of digital sales, working with a lot of lead generation marketing, as well as customer care and support within the utility space as of my most recent years. So the first thing that we really wanted to address when we kind of looked at, how we kind of leverage AI as a best practice. And to give everyone a little bit of context about who ContactPoint 360 is, we essentially are a BPO helping the world's kind of biggest brands when it comes to transforming the customer experience. We take a employee-first philosophy, and with our deep domain expertise and best-in-class contact center technology, helps us deliver exceptional end-to-end customer solutions. Every day, we unite people across the world through our omni-channel communication systems and our bespoke approach. We believe that delivering constant customer experience excellence requires unceasing innovation and steadfast commitment to being the best. We're strong proponents of data analytics, and we love to provide our clients with insights and analysis designed to drive efficiencies and to perfect the customer journey. So, to understand kind of the context in terms of where the need or the interest even peaked for ContactPoint 360 was first understanding what the problem statement that we saw in the industry when it comes to hiring and bringing on top talent. So the problem statement was really, how do we quantify the skill proficiency of applicants and or candidates in this ever-changing landscape that are applying to organizations? Some of the challenges as kind of sub-points to those problem statements is your customers and your stakeholders report that team members don't always understand instructions or they lack active listening skills. In a project, there are only a few members who can converse confidently with the customer and understand their perspective and the challenges they are facing. In addition, there are other challenges such as team members not being able to express status updates and communicate to customers through proper use of concise and succinct verbiage. And in other instances, we also saw that team members could not sufficiently interpret business documents and derive value from them. And this all had impacts in terms of the overall interactions that customers were having with our folks. So then we started to understand and reach out to various different platform providers and AI-led kind of assessment companies. And we really wanted to ask the question, how can artificial intelligence be leveraged to augment our hiring and vetting process when we select top talent? So hiring top talent goes beyond what is on a candidate's resume and through the reference checks. While these checks and balances are absolutely necessary to validate the accuracy and the honesty of a candidate, an influx of new AI-powered skills assessment platforms can be leveraged now to capture empirical data to establish these benchmarks on what a strong candidate looks like, or what we call the ideal candidate persona. There are many platforms out there such as iMocha, Zor, Fetcher, Arya. They all provide various AI-based technology platforms to truly qualify a candidate and ensure you're hiring the best talent for the selected role. But there are so many platforms out there. How do I navigate this vast landscape of AI-based solutions? So AI platforms, like I mentioned before, truly enable us to quantify and gather data around the best talent and how they've kind of conducted these assessments. While some solutions in the market are going to be more geared towards the facilitation of interviews through chatbots, or there's others like iMocha or Immersion AI, which are going to be more focused on the ability to quantify a candidate's skill sets for the role they're applying for. So it's really important when looking at AI platforms and technologies where you kind of want to be embedding these technologies to augment that process. For us, it was really at the early stages of the onboarding process to understand how do we get better conversion as candidates move through the hiring process and through that onboarding journey. So it's very critical that you leverage the right AI-based solutions to serve your hiring needs and the processes that you've established as best practice. So at CP360, we've partnered up with an AI-powered skills assessment platform that gives us actually access to 2,000 plus different assessments. And these assessments range from financial aptitude tests to customer service, all the way to coding and PHP full stack development. And that's actually where our journey started, was because we had a need to really bring on a team of developers. And from a recruiting standpoint, we wanted to make sure that individuals going through this onboarding process, we were able to kind of set benchmarks and really quantify their ability to actually do the work before they moved on to the next stage of the interview process. So depending on the role or the job requirement, the AI solution really can have specific testing that can gauge a candidate's proficiency and experience. The key point that I want to call out is that we can't always just depend solely on the AI to make the decision whether it's a pass or fail. What we leverage the AI in our recruiting and onboarding process is solely to give us that empirical data, to give us a benchmark and be able for us to calibrate and align on how we can, change this ideal candidate persona as we continue to hire new people, and to make sure that we're setting the right benchmarks for the AI to qualify. So going beyond the quote unquote hard skills, as many professionals in talent acquisition and recruiting know, hiring top talent goes above and beyond just quantifying one's ability to do the day-to-day tasks. There's qualitative characteristics as well, such as positive attitude, grit, being a strong team player, strong leadership abilities, interpersonal and communication, as well as consistency. And these can always be captured by AI platforms or by skills assessments. And as the title precludes, the question still remains, how do we augment the hiring process and leverage AI as part of this process? We've taken the approach here to embed AI skills assessment testing as part of that hiring process. Essentially, how the process looks like is candidates will apply for the role, and whether you have job postings on Indeed, on LinkedIn, social media, you can set filtration criteria at the onset to make sure that they have the right years of experience, that this is really a role that they are keen on and that have experience with. Then from there, the HRIS and ATS systems will then to start to filter out those criteria that are matched for the role. And the recruiters from CP360 will then screen the candidates through a phone call. Once we have that alignment, because we fundamentally also believe that to drive a strong positive work culture, it's about bringing in the right talent, level setting the right expectations with them. Because if there's misalignment on any of these areas, you may look at potential attrition, or when they start, they might realize it's not what they signed up for. So once that phone call happens, the recruiters and the HR teams understand, yes, they're aligned with their understanding of the roles and responsibilities of the role that we're hiring for. We then send out the AI assessment, which ranges anywhere between 20 to 45 minutes. There are times, depending on the role again, where we've actually sent out multiple assessments. Then the results are shared with us through the AI platform. And based on the benchmark scores, our recruiters and HR teams then decide whether we move them to the next part of the interview process or deem them as not qualified based on the assessment scores and the initial phone calls. So when we look at how to leverage AI to augment vetting process, there's really three components that we looked at when selecting our vendors out and partners that we were working with. And that was to really make sure that there was a broad and really broad encompassing library of skills that we could assess candidates on depending on the roles we were selecting them for. There were hundreds of questions ready for each skill. We had coding simulators and sandboxes for more of those development type roles. And a very important part for us was also that we had proctoring abilities. So whether this was video, image, and sound. Being a BPO, it's really important for us and for our clients that when customers are calling in, that especially even in a remote setting where agents are working from home, that we have the ability to make sure that when someone's calling in, it's a seamless experience for them. And that's why the proctoring was really important for us, especially in 2020 Q1, when we had to really pivot quickly to this remote setting and hire people remotely. We needed extra levels of control within the recruiting process to make sure people were compliant. Regardless of the roles that we hire for, AI solutions we leverage have the ability to test and assess candidates through their comprehensive skills assessment libraries. And another big differentiator for us in selecting the partners was we also wanted to make sure that they could integrate with our HRIS and our ATS systems. So what this allows us to do is actually enhance the HRIS. So when we look at top quartile performers or individuals that exude high levels of grit and team player type mentality, we can start to then understand maybe this is what we need to calibrate in terms of this type of profile. How do we work with our AR provider to create customized assessments to test for these skills and quantify them? And when we're able to do this, it really starts to create more data points that we can be more strategic on in terms of how we forecast and how we build out new roles and responsibilities, and what are we truly seeking as part of those requirements. And it was really interesting when we looked at, some of the case studies that we did in the past. We always had thought, maybe our top sales performers are the ones that have the most sales experience. But then we found it was a combination of, yes, sales experience, but we also found that they were very eager to learn. And when we embedded that eagerness to learn as a component and requirement for sales type individuals, and we worked with our AR provider to kind of test for those skills and really qualified and vetted those skill sets during the interview process, it allowed us to get more like-minded individuals that shared that same level of energy, that were really keen on learning outside of work and making the investments in themselves. And this we found as a key benchmark to drive strong sales performance. So a lot of this data helps us calibrate and realign in terms of the strategy from an onboarding perspective and how we even go to market in advertising some of those roles. On this slide here, I just wanted to show some of the sample skills assessment libraries. So again, they have banking and financial. We have domain expertise when it comes to Six Sigma, black belt, or supply chain. There are a lot of business skills that we can test for, whether it's professional writing, customer service, business analysis, your MS Office suite. And if it's more on the technical type of roles or infrastructure, it would really test on DevOps, AWS, Azure environments, as well as coding sandboxes. And the partner that we work with specifically partners up with a lot of large software companies like SAP, SFDC, Oracle, and Workday to actually work with them to create customized assessments that candidates who will be using these tools on a day-to-day basis can take. So when it does come time for them to onboard and they've made it past the selection process, when they're actually doing the work, it's familiar to them because they've already gone through some of the sandbox tests and it's not alien. They're like, hey, this is what I actually did my interview process with. Now we're just building on that. And that creates that alignment that I was talking about earlier and bringing in the right talent to drive a positive work culture. Some of the platform capabilities that's really important to keep in mind, because any type of new platform is going to almost be like a kid's soccer team with all different departments chasing after the same ball. And this is where IT, security, compliance, recruiting, HR, operations, a lot of these stakeholders get involved in the process to understand, how can it bring benefit to them. So when we were looking at how do we select the right partners from an AI perspective, we wanted them to be enterprise ready, that they had proctoring, as I mentioned, available, that they had the ability to conduct video interviews as well. It's in this kind of hybridized landscape. And now that we're moving towards brick and mortar again, it's really important that we found a vendor that was very dynamic in meeting our needs in terms of how we pivoted our strategy as well. In addition, having a dedicated account manager allowed the AI provider to give us meaningful insights about candidates, the skills, the tests, what recommendations they could give to us in terms of how we could customize or roll out different types of assessments through the AI platform to really make sure that we're vetting all the right parties in the right manner. And as I mentioned, from a consulting perspective, right, to having a dedicated account manager really gave us the support that we needed. And it's really important that any provider from an AI perspective, whether it's on the assessment side or whether it's more so on natural language processing and understanding how someone speaks in an interview process, it's still really important to make sure that you have that support and dedicated account manager from their side to be able to provide meaningful insights and strategies around that. So I'm going to go into the AI proctoring pillar, and this was a really important one for us, as I mentioned, because when we pivoted to a work from home type setting for a lot of agents in 2020, we wanted to make sure that people were in a secured environment, that there wasn't a lot of background noises, that they were in a private space as well, that there weren't, a lot of background movements and things happening as well. So what our platform that we partnered up with allowed us to not only roll out image proctoring, but it also gave us a window lock feature, video proctoring, audio proctoring, IP access restrictions, as well as a randomization of questions and answers. And the goal of this is to prevent cheating. And what we actually found when we first rolled this out was we had 8 candidates that went through the assessments, and our HR started, calling me and said, hey, I think, we're having some issues with the technology. A lot of people aren't able to get past the assessment. So when we reached out to our provider and our account manager, we actually found that there were about 36 image violations in total across all of those 8 candidates. And what that meant was they noticed that someone was in the background whispering in their ear the right answer, or we had noticed that it was a completely different person that was taking the assessment and it had kicked them out. In 2 of the cases, the assessment was actually forwarded to an IP out of a different country. And when that person tried to take the assessment, because of the IP access restriction, it was flagged as a violation that this individual sent it to someone else to try to trick the system. These were really important checks to have in place to protect ourselves and to also protect our client. And this prevented any type of security risk from an IT perspective as well for people joining our network that were not who they said they were as well. Communication is also a very big aspect and a very strong area that AI platforms right now can do a lot of assessments for. So when we look at speaking, writing, reading, and listening, the assessment, they try to keep it as fun and engaging as possible. And the evaluation parameters that we've worked with our partner on is really, again, natural language processing based on video questions and their ability to write down responses. There's also sentiment analysis. So if there's certain verbiage that's a little bit borderline assertive and too aggressive, it'll flag those out as well as grammar, vocabulary, spelling, oral fluency, email writing, and face recognition. A lot of specifically within our industry, when it comes to language assessments, they use the CEFR scale from the B1 to C1 scale. But again, many providers can customize that depending on the needs of your hiring requirements. So as I mentioned, with the current platform that we work with, 2,000 plus skills assessments. An example of some of the ones that they partner up with right now is Azure, AWS, Office, Oracle, SAP, SFDC. And this is really from the technical side and platform perspective. When we look at the business skills, they have financial, they have business services, and communication skills as all part of those assessments as well. And one of the points that I wanted to mention was it's also really important that we don't sandbag the AI technology either or limit it, because what we also found was upon onboarding an individual, training them, and them going through the workflow, we actually started to roll out more ongoing assessments through the AI to do spot checks and to help our training team and leverage, kind of integrate that with their LMS to say, hey, how can we customize some of these assessments that we roll as regular spot checks to make sure that people are understanding and building on their knowledge? How do we merge the two kind of platforms together from a training perspective and even leverage the AI assessments as part of that process? So there's a lot of opportunities that we've kind of looked at where we can scale this platform in terms of operational excellence, training excellence, things of that nature. So from a reporting perspective, again, it's always important to understand what's the data not telling us, or what's the insight or strategy that's recommending based on the trends and patterns that we've seen. What I have here on my screen are some examples of different reportings and dashboards available through AI. And this allows us to help get a better understanding in terms of onboarding. What does our funnel pipeline look like? How are we converting? And how is this having a positive or negative impact in terms of recruiting processes? What we initially noticed when we first brought in the AI platform was we had a lot of drop off at the top funnel, because when people got the assessments, we actually saw a much higher dropout, about 25% higher than we normally would see if we didn't include the assessments. This was very alarming for us because we felt that maybe the assessments were scaring people away or scaring good candidates away. We waited a bit to see what the full funnel pipeline conversion looked like. We then saw that those that took the assessment, the percentage for them to move from second stage interview to actually be selected, that conversion rate increased substantially, about 34% to make it to the final interview, and about a 15% increase in terms of just overall conversion rates that we saw at the top funnel for those that took the assessments. So then we kind of took a sigh of relief. We're like, okay, it's not scaring people away. It might just be scaring the wrong people away because they don't want to take the assessment or they're nervous about it. So what it gave us was a bunch of very qualified and confident individuals that were taking these assessments. We then looked at the benchmark scores, parsed that with the feedback from the final interview stages to then understand, okay, is this assessment truly serving its purpose, or is it a little bit too challenging, or do we need to make it even a bit more rigorous? Again, here are some additional metrics that we keep an eye on in terms of the candidate response rate, how many people are actually taking the assessments, the speed to taking the assessments, and areas of opportunity for each person depending on the type of assessment that they're taking. A lot of this information is very helpful for onboarding teams because when they understand how someone scores at the benchmark, they can then tailor their training to really focus on certain areas that that individual that we think will need help with based on what the AI had told us from the assessments. So the next biggest challenge for me was, how do I get buy-in from the stakeholders? How do I sell this internally and really make sure that we get utilization out of it? In so many organizations in the past, I've seen projects get launched, I've seen huge investments being made in technologies, and then you have 10% utilization, and then that dwindles down, fizzles out. And now we're on a 1-year contract paying a provider for a tool that we're not really using. So for me, it was about, how do I make sure that this brings value to all the functional departments that would use this? So there's really 4 pillars that I based that around. The first was training team insights and learning and development team insights. Trainers now have a precise view of new hire strengths, the weaknesses, and where they can focus their training efforts. Learning styles, whether you're kinesthetic, audio, or visual, we have the ability now to adapt training delivery and embed certain gamification depending on what the assessment comes back with, that this person is definitely way more visual, so diagrams are going to help a lot. Or if they're more if they're more of a kinesthetic, taking a more hands-on approach, right? Doing knowledge concepts, giving them a chance to practice. But again, the AI is able to give us this data so we can pivot those strategies. The third major pillar from a business impact perspective was that it helps us bring in top talent. Through detailed assessments, we can ensure we're bringing in top talent by improving retention and minimizing attrition. Like I said at the very beginning, it's when we bring in the right talent, marry that with level setting the right expectations, you're going to drive a stronger work culture, which reduces attrition, and maximizes retention. The fourth major pillar in terms of how we sold this internally was also the technology piece. Because the nature of, in our industry, a lot of the agents, we need them to be very tech savvy. We need them to be able to navigate a high level of complexity, complex tools very quickly. So really by ensuring all new hires have proficiency in office tools and platforms, this saved us about 2.5 to 3.5 hours within the first week when it came to IT troubleshooting. And it allowed us to really understand, do these people and new hires that we're bringing on, are they proficient in the office tools that we use or whatever tools that you may use? And this, again, will really help accelerate and act as a springboard for new hires joining the company that they can dive right into, the meat of the training and their knowledge objectives. Then I wanted to present, what were the expected impacts and results when we looked at bringing on an AI to augment our hiring process. So the first was hiring velocity. By having data and reporting on candidates' strengths and weaknesses and opportunities, you'll be able to move faster on aligning candidates to the positions that you're hiring for. Training throughput. By ensuring there is strong alignment in candidate skill set and the required roles and responsibilities, we expect to also see improvements in training throughput. Backfill reduction. The more successful candidates we have graduating and performing well out of the gate will minimize production attrition in the first 30 days. And moreover, it'll reduce the need for ongoing backfill attrition hiring. Then when we look at retention and culture, when employees are hired correctly for the roles and responsibilities expected of them, they perform better. This drives a positive work culture and improves retention across all levels. And the fifth was obviously cost. Stronger retention, positive culture, employees that are performing and being recognized will have tremendous impact on reducing training costs. Because of the nature of the industry that we serve as a BPO, we're hiring a large population of frontline agents that are taking customer interaction calls, that are making outbound sales. So for us, it was to frame up the value add at a business level, it made a lot of sense when we look at the backfill reduction and just the overall retention that we can see here. In addition, the hiring velocity gave us the ability to be very flexible and dynamic in terms of serving our clients' needs as well. And this is to really kind of sum up the inherent benefits that we saw when we looked at artificial intelligence and how that was embedded in the onboarding process at the beginning stages. To kind of wrap things up before we go into the question and answer period as well, there's also 4 other areas that we wanted to kind of talk to here about the business impacts and how we can get that buy-in from the stakeholders. From a leadership perspective, improved retention leads to longer tenure of skilled employees that can be potentially leveraged for internal promotions, whether you're moving them into a management position or a support type function. Efficiency. When a team has longer tenure, more ideas come to the table to drive operational efficiency. This can save our clients money, it can save yourselves money, and it can ultimately bring more value add to the organization for when you have long-term and more permanent employees. KPI performance. Now, while tenure and how long you've been with the company doesn't equate to having strong performance, having tenured with the right individuals that the AI can help assess and help drive KPI performance will equip leaders with data on how to coach more effectively. And finally, when it comes to growth, while artificial intelligence can't be solely attributed to a company's growth, assessing tenure, retention, training, and throughput for the first 30 and 60 days of KPI performance will provide invaluable insights to you to share back with not only your consultants and your account executives at the AI platform, but also internally as well. So Farron, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that great insight, Daniel. Much appreciated. I will request our audience to now type in any questions that you may have for Daniel, and I'll ask them as they come up in order. So Daniel, maybe to start things off, I'll ask a few questions of you as we wait for more questions from the audience to come in. To start things off, what have been some of the constraints or challenges you've seen or can foresee when leveraging the AI-led assessment tools in recruiting?
Great question. I think the first kind of pitfall that we want to avoid is that the AI is not a pass or fail mechanism, and we cannot let or trust the AI to solely be responsible for that. Nor can we let the AI replace the process in its entirety, right? Because nothing is more powerful than a conversation when it comes to understanding a candidate. Now, there are individuals that we've noticed that interview very well, but don't necessarily put together the best CV, and vice versa. So the AI was really used for us to capture the data points, to understand and quantify what someone's telling us or what they're unable to tell us during an interview panel, because it allowed us to be a lot more objective when selecting the best candidate. But I think the key point to answer your question, Farron, is that we can't be the sole answer to the golden nugget to everything. There still needs to be that human element and proponents when we're going through onboarding and talent selection.
Yeah, absolutely. That human element is so key, and that can never be replaced. So I agree with that. Yeah. Also, can you talk about how can an AI-led assessment perhaps help acquire top talent for a variety of other types of positions?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's so many platforms out there, right? And it really depends what you want to leverage the AI for, right? Is it assessments? Is it facilitation of the actual interviews? Because they have like chatbot type styles that can do the initial screening interviews now. But when it comes to like other types of roles, and again, being in the BPO space, primarily we're hiring a lot of customer service, customer care type agents. But for us, the need actually came when we were tasked to, bring on a development team. And, our tech team was asking like, how do we make sure that if they say they have Python experience, how do we quantify that like during an interview? So I said, well, you shouldn't be doing that during an interview because it's going to take them 35 minutes, 40 minutes to code what you want them to code. And it's going to be really challenging for you to gauge that. And that's what actually sparked the conversation for us to look into it. So when we look at other roles, it's important to look at an AI platform that has that diversity and experience in terms of testing and assessing skill sets as it relates to business functions, right? Whether it's an account manager type role, or whether it's more programmatic in development or coding, right? Or conversely, if you have HR or you have recruiting and training resources that you're trying to bring on board, it's important to find a platform that has all those kind of functional departments readily available in terms of how they assess that talent.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question here from the audience now. In your opinion, will leveraging AI result in a barrier for DE&I processes, and can the candidate experience such an opportunity?
No. So when we look at diversity, equality, and inclusion, right, it's actually the opposite of that. We felt that by leveraging AI, it expanded and created more objective opportunities for individuals because, and I'll explain why, it's like I mentioned before, some people will put a really strong CV together, but they don't interview well, and they may have been able to actually do the work. And sometimes when we leverage only the interview as the kind of benchmark as to where we select individuals, a lot of individuals, a strong talent, we may have lost out on because we hadn't given them the chance to actually prove what they can do. And that's why from a DE&I perspective, the AI actually can really open it up to give you the data points to make an objective and fair decision as well in selecting the right candidates.
Sure. Perfect, thank you. So Daniel, how can these solutions and strategies around leveraging AI in the talent acquisition process assist in hiring for remote workers?
Absolutely. So remote working's, couple of things. There are actually some platforms out there that can do AI type video interviews. I wasn't a huge fan of it because I just found it a little bit strange to be talking to a robot on my first interaction with someone from the company. But there are platforms like that available where it can kind of understand their sentiment. And when we kind of look at the right platforms to select, right, sorry, Frank, do you want to just kind of repeat the second part of that question there?
Sorry?
You want to just repeat that question there? I just want to.
Yeah, so how can your solutions around leveraging AI in the talent acquisition process assist in hiring remote workers?
Right. So when it comes specifically to the remote workers, we didn't want to look at leveraging AI just to kind of fit the mold in terms of what we were seeing in 2020 and during the pandemic. We wanted to make sure that this could be applied even in a transition back to brick and mortar. So in a remote worker setting, what this allowed us to do was it helped us from a qualification perspective. So we had, let's say, 100 candidates, 80 of them would get the assessments, maybe 30 of them would actually take the assessments. This actually helped the remote working workflows, because what we actually embedded as part of those assessments were a lot of those proctoring elements that we talked about to make sure that they are in an environment that's conducive for success when working remote. And it also allowed us to remove a layer of kind of manual testing by doing the automated assessments through the AI. And the candidates that would come back, those would automatically move on to the next stage if they met those benchmarks. So it did speed up the process, and also allow us to make sure that all of the safeguards, the technology pieces, the environment that they were working in was also conducive for being able to work in a remote setting as well.
Awesome, thank you. So one of our audience members asking that they're now in a candidate-driven labor market. So have you used it when there is an excess of candidates to narrow down the candidate pool prior to the telephone screening?
Yes, as we all know, Great Resignation, and now we're starting to see that it's an employee's market. And the goal here is, how do we approach the great re-engagement of the talent and labor pools that we see? When it comes to the excess that we have, that's a really interesting question, actually. So we've seen the same thing, because especially at a frontline staff level, when we go through the interviews vetting process, we've actually seen a number of people that necessarily don't start, even though they've gone through the full interview process and they made the commitments, because they may have 4 other job offers on the table that they're just kind of waiting to hear back from. For us, the AI cannot help vet that process out, because again, that's really where it's important to have the conversation, right? So for us, it's the assessment gets rolled out, they pass it, or we deem it as a pass. We'll have an open and honest conversation with them to understand where they are in that process, and to understand, if there are other jobs on the table that they're waiting to field out. And for us, I think it's a very organic way in terms of vetting out that excess to make sure that, the people that we do hire actually do start and make it through. But to answer your question, long and the short, from an AI perspective, it's not there yet to be able to kind of manage that excess in terms of those kind of conversations, because again, it is an employee's market. Even some provinces in Canada, we've seen the number of job openings increase by about 80,000 per month, right? And again, that's exponential in the United States, right? So it definitely is an employee's market, but the AI can help, I think, vet out the ones that are most qualified based on your criteria. But it won't vet out those that are kind of going through multiple interviews, or jumping ship last minute because they got a better offer that came through last minute.
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, that's great, Daniel. Thank you so much for answering those. Again, I'll ask our audience, if you have any more questions, please let us know, and I'll ask them to Daniel. In the meantime, as we wait for more questions, Daniel, is there anything else perhaps that you'd like to leave our audience with as final thoughts, or anything that you'd like to emphasize?
Nothing that we haven't already covered, Farron. I think, right, AI is a very broad topic that covers so many different things, and that's why the subject title for this webinar was so long, because it needed to be very specific to what we're talking about in terms of how to leverage AI. And it can be a very daunting landscape to navigate. And I think when business leaders look into where they can augment certain processes with AI, it's important that you get a unanimous decision, that everyone has a piece to look into it, even if it's not within their direct scope, because the talent we bring on board is going to have a ripple effect to anyone that they work with anyways. So it's very important that you get that buy-in collectively, and that it's not a rip and replace or lift and shift type technology, but it's specifically used to enhance some of those processes to make your lives easier when it comes to selecting talent, right? And I know some of those questions were indicative of that as well, because it's like, I'm getting so many excess of candidates coming through, or what's the best stage to use this, or how do I kind of remove a stage in the recruiting process? Again, there is a learning curve in terms of how to integrate it, because every company has different needs in terms of who they're seeking in terms of talent and culture. And you want to really make sure that all parties from a leadership and decision-making process are involved in that selection process, because you want to make sure it aligns with your culture as well.
Fantastic, great final thoughts, Daniel. And with that, I think we'll bring our conversation series for today to a close, as I don't see any more questions. Thanks for taking the time to answer those. I'll remind our audience that all our future events and webinars can be found again on the new Electricity Canada website, as well as on Current Affairs. In closing, Daniel, thank you very much for taking the time. Again, I'd like to thank ContactPoint 360 and all of our audience members for joining us today. Hopefully you found it valuable, and we'll look forward to speaking with you on the next conversation series taking place on March the 23rd. Until then, take care and bye for now.
Thanks for having me, friend. Thank you, everyone. Take care.